Hello, welcome to Post Colonial Space. I'm Masood Raja, and today I'll briefly talk about Michel Foucault's very important 1969 essay called What is an Author? Now, I do teach this essay in my literary theory classes, but just recently someone in the comments had requested me to record a brief conversation on it, so I thought I should go ahead and do that. Now, the way I will do it is I will read some parts of the essay and then share my thoughts with you about the whole essay and also the reading itself. But please keep in mind that no amount of lecturing on this topic is going to make this comprehensible or exhaustively explicatory for you. What this essay will require and always will is that you should read it carefully with an idea about general oeuvre of Foucault himself. So reading is absolutely essential. Now, I'll post a link to the full essay in the description. It is freely available online, and I do highly recommend that you should read the whole essay. And then if you watch this video, maybe this video will act as a supplement. Now, the first thing to keep in mind before we go into the essay itself is that it's a response essay, right? Foucault himself declares it. And the response is to the critiques of the book that he had recently published. And that is The Order of Things, right? And in The Order of Things, Foucault gives us the discursive history of three fields of what he would call scientific study, right? Economics, natural history, right? And finances and wealth, I think. And that will come across in my reading as well. And in the process of doing that, he had attributed certain thoughts or clusters of thoughts to certain proper names of the authors, right? He had grouped certain authors together. So the impression that the readers, of course, the critical readers got was that he had lumped these authors together and maybe he was suggesting that there is a correlation, right? Or that his reading of the authors or their intentions or their discursive production was not exhaustive enough because he had not covered them in that great detail. And that is where he starts, right? He immediately points to the critiques and what kind of critique was mobilized. So let's read it. Is an author. In proposing this slightly odd question, I'm conscious of the need for an explanation. To this day, the author remains an open question both with respect to its general function within discourse and in my own writings. That is, this question permits me to return to certain aspects of my own work which now appear ill-advised and misleading. In this regard, I wish to propose a necessary criticism and re-evaluation. For instance, my objective in The Order of Things had been to analyze verbal clusters as discursive layers which fall outside the familiar categories of a book, a work, or an author. But while I considered natural history, the analysis of wealth, and political economy in general terms, I neglected a similar analysis of the author and his works. It is perhaps due to this omission that I employed the names of authors throughout this book in a naive and often crude fashion. I spoke of Buffon, Cuvier, Ricardo, and others as well, but failed to realize that I had allowed their names to function ambiguously. This has proved an embarrassment to me in that my oversight has served to raise two pertinent objections. It was argued that I had not properly described Buffon or his work and that my handling of Marx was pitifully inadequate in terms of the totality of his thought. Although these objections were obviously justified, they ignored the task I had set myself. I had no intention of describing Buffon or Marx, or of reproducing their statements or implicit meanings, but, simply stated, I wanted to locate the rules that formed a certain number of concepts and theoretical relationships in their works. In addition, it was argued that I had created monstrous families by bringing together names as disparate as Buffon and Linnaeus, or in placing Cuvier next to Darwin in defiance of the most readily observable family resemblances and natural ties. This objection also seems inappropriate since I had never tried to establish a genealogical table of exceptional individuals, nor was I concerned in forming an intellectual daguerreotype of the scholar or naturalist of the 17th and 18th century. In fact, I had no intention of forming any family, whether holy or perverse. On the contrary, I wanted to determine a much more modest task, the functional conditions of specific discursive practices. So as you heard me read, after he lays down the necessity for writing this paper and the two critiques that he had received, and where he corrects his critics that is not what I had intended, he then goes on to articulate his vision of what needs to be done. And it's very clearly stated, right? What is the question of author in contemporary times, and then how is he going to tackle it or try to answer that question? Okay. Now keep in mind that all of this is in response to the critique of his own use of authorial figures in different discursive clusters in the order of things. And this essay, of course, is a response to that, but in the process of doing that, he is also theorizing the function of the author in a given discourse, and that is why this essay is extremely important for all of us who do literary studies, but also people who do historiography and who do research in social sciences. So let's read his declaration about the author and what is he proposing to do exactly in this particular paper. The question of the author demands a more direct response. Even now, when we study the history of a concept, a literary genre, or a branch of philosophy, these concerns assume a relatively weak and secondary position in relation to the solid and fundamental role of an author and his works. For the purposes of this paper, I will set aside a socio-historical analysis of the author as an individual and the numerous questions that deserve attention in this context. How the author was individualized in a culture such as ours, the status we have given the author, for instance, when we began our research into authenticity and attribution, the system of valorization in which he was included, or the moment when the stories of heroes gave way to an author's biography. The conditions that fostered the formulation of the fundamental critical category of the man and his work. For the time being, I wish to restrict myself to the singular relationship that holds between an author and a text, the manner in which a text apparently points to this figure who is outside and precedes it. Okay, so far here are some of the things that we are clear about. That this essay, What is an Author, is a response to the critiques that Foucault had received about the way he handled the subject of the author in the order of things. 2, he is trying to also tell us that the figure of the author is prominent in the Western tradition and is often invoked as a stable entity, and that needs to be studied. And then in the last paragraph that I read, he is basically saying there are many ways in which we could read the figure of the author and talk about it, social historic construction of the author and everything else, but he's saying, no, I am going to precisely just stay on one relationship, and that is the relationship between the author and a text, right? These two categories, and to try to explain as to how is it that a text that is in our hands already presupposes an author that exists outside of it, right? How does that relationship develop? And he says that is what I'm going to try to answer in this paper entitled What is an Author? So here we are. We'll continue reading a little more and talk a little more about the subject. Now, please keep in mind, I will be recording it in different sessions, so I might look different and the setup might look different, but one thing that will run through this entire conversation is that we'll be talking about Foucault's What is an Author. So I will now go on and read a little bit of where he tells us how writing itself has changed, right? These are some very dense and complex paragraphs. I'm not going to read all of them, but I'll pick up some major points that he makes, because that change in writing itself is what is crucial to his theorization of what is an author. So let's go and read a little more. Beckett supplies a direction. What matter who's speaking? Someone said. What matter who's speaking? In an indifference such as this, we must recognize one of the fundamental ethical principles of contemporary writing. It is not simply ethical because it characterizes our way of speaking and writing, but because it stands as an immanent rule, endlessly adopted and yet never fully applied. As a principle, it dominates writing as an ongoing practice and slights our customary attention to the finished product. For the sake of illustration, we need only consider two of its major themes. First, the writing of our day has freed itself from the necessity of expression. It only refers to itself, yet it is not restricted to the confines of interiority. On the contrary, we recognize it in its exterior deployment. This reversal transforms writing into an interplay of signs regulated less by the content it signifies than by the very nature of the signifier. Moreover, it implies an action that is always testing the limits of its regularity, transgressing and reversing an order that it accepts and manipulates. Writing unfolds like a game that inevitably moves beyond its own rules and finally leaves them behind. Thus, the essential basis of this writing is not the exalted emotions related to the act of composition or the insertion of a subject into language. Rather, it is primarily concerned with creating an opening where the writing subject endlessly disappears. The second theme is even more familiar. It is the kinship between writing and death. Okay, so the parts of the passages that I just read, and you can continue reading, what Foucault is trying to assert here is that the writing itself is different. And he starts with a quote from Beckett, which basically displays a sort of indifference to the writing itself, not writing itself, but who is saying what. Because the concern in modernism and postmodernism ought not to be what is authorial attention and what is being said. So that means that the composition act of writing that claimed to capture reality and represent it in the signs is no longer feasible. It's not realistic fiction anymore. It's modernism, postmodernism. So what do the authors do in modernism? They are not writing about themselves. They are working with language, pushing it to its limit. I mean, Beckett, Joyce, Virginia Woolf, and others. So writing then becomes more about what language does, and within that then not what the words contain in themselves, but how the act of signification itself works, how reading is recursive, writing is recursive. All of those things bear upon the act of writing itself, and that's where these two themes emerge. One, that writing is no longer capturing something and representing it in signs, but it's also about being recursive, right? About playing with language itself. And now that you will understand only if you understand Saussurean linguistics, right? And the differential nature of the sign and all that, and I have videos on that. The second part that I briefly touched upon, the second theme, is the connection of writing to death. Where is he going with that? So where he's going with that is he's pulling from two traditions, at least in this essay, that in the Greek tragedy, the hero died young so that he could be remembered in stories. I mean, think of Achilles, right? He agrees to die young if he could be remembered in the stories afterwards. So what writing captured was your death, but made you immortal. Similarly, when we read Alif Layla wal Layl, 1001 Nights, writing or the act of storytelling is about avoiding death, because for as long as she can continue a story, bring it to a climax, but not conclude it at the end of the night, she gets to live another day, right? But now what he's saying is another theme is that writing is no longer there to save the storyteller from symbolic and, in case of Sherazad, literal death, but that a new concept, a new way of looking at writing is emerged, and that is that the author dies at the moment he or she sends his work out in the world. Death of the author, right? So he's playing with what we already learned in Barth, right? Death of the author, that we are now within the province of the reader. The reader gets to decide what a text means, and the author's job is to efface his or her presence in the text, first by employing language as non-representational and non-compositional, and two, by constantly erasing his or herself in the process of writing, so that the signs on a page, the narrative itself, takes over its own form. So if we keep these two things in mind, what Foucault is then trying to teach us is that this is the nature of writing, or how writing is understood in our age. And in order to understand the role of the author, the function of the author, we first need to understand how writing is understood in our age, and his age is, he's writing in 1969. So that is all that I have to say in this conversation. I had planned to record it in one go, but I'm realizing that this needs, more deliberation and a slow progress through the essay. So I'm going to record it in different parts. So let us consider this part one, my beginning conversation on Foucault's What is an Author. I will soon be back with the next installment. Meanwhile, I do highly encourage you to read the essay and then, of course, contribute your thoughts and your questions as I'm recording. That way I don't have to respond in the comments. Maybe I can record a response. So I hope you're enjoying this journey, and I'll be back with the next installment of my discussion of death of what is an author. Thank you so much. I hope you're staying safe and taking care of each other. Please continue to do so, and I will now see you next time. Until then, as always, from me to you, peace and love.